Before we begin today's story, tell us where you're watching from and whether you believe one skill can completely change a person's future. And if you enjoy heartfelt frontier stories about courage, family, and unexpected love, subscribe to USOS Stories and join us for more journeys across the American frontier. The torn canvas flaps snapped in the Wyoming wind like a wounded flag. Most people saw an old wagon cover ready for the fire. Martha Bell saw a ranch slowly bleeding itself to death, and that difference would change everything. Spring arrived reluctantly in the Sweetwater Valley of Wyoming in 1887. Gray clouds hung low over the prairie. The grass had only begun to turn green. The mud roads still carried the scars of winter. On the depot platform, Wendell Carver stood waiting beside the arriving train. At 34 years old, he looked older. Years of drought, broken equipment, failing fences, and lonely evenings had carved deep lines into his face. He owned 400 acres, at least on paper. In reality, he owned a collection of problems stretched across 400 acres. The barn leaned slightly west. Fence posts rotted where they stood. Canvas wagon covers leaked. Grain sacks split. Harness straps cracked. Every season seemed to take more from the ranch than it gave back. Yet none of those problems felt as heavy as the silence waiting for him every night. That was why he had written to a marriage agency in St. Louis. Not because he expected romance, not because he dreamed of some grand love story. He simply wanted a home, a warm meal, a voice in the house besides his own. Most of all, he wanted someone who could sew curtains. Curtains. Looking back years later, Wendell would laugh at how small his expectations had been. Have you ever asked life for one simple thing, only to discover you actually needed something completely different? The train hissed to a stop. Passengers stepped down one by one. Families, traveling salesmen, laborers. Then he saw her, a tall woman in a worn brown traveling dress. Not beautiful in the way magazine illustrations described beauty. Not delicate, not fragile, but calm, steady. Her eyes moved across the platform as though she were studying a puzzle nobody else had noticed. In one hand she carried a carpet bag. In the other was a long wooden box. The box immediately caught Wendell's attention. It looked too heavy for clothing, too narrow for household goods, too important to be ordinary. The woman approached him first. "Mr. Carver." Her voice was clear and confident. "Yes." She extended her hand. "I'm Martha Bell." No nervous smile, no fluttering excitement, no awkward conversation. Just a firm handshake and direct eye contact. For reasons he couldn't explain, Wendell suddenly felt as though she were evaluating him instead of the other way around. The wagon ride to the ranch lasted nearly 2 hours. The entire trip, Martha asked questions, not about curtains, not about neighbors, not about church socials. She asked about rainfall, cattle losses, feed costs, transportation routes, storage buildings, broken equipment. At one point, Wendell glanced sideways and asked, "You know quite a bit about ranching." "Not ranching," Martha answered. "Survival." That answer stayed with him. The sun was setting when they finally reached the ranch. Wendell waited for disappointment. Most people reacted the same way when they first saw the place. The sagging fences, the weathered buildings, the exhausted appearance of everything. But Martha didn't complain. She didn't sigh. She didn't ask to return to town. Instead, she climbed down from the wagon and walked directly toward an old grain wagon parked beside the barn. The canvas cover hanging over it was ripped nearly from end to end. Martha examined the tear carefully. She touched the fabric, studied the stitching, followed the rip with her fingers. Then she looked across the ranch, at the tents, at the grain sacks, at the horse gear, at the worn tarps, at the weathered canvas everywhere. Finally, she spoke. "This ranch isn't losing money through cattle." Wendell frowned. "What do you mean?" She pointed toward the torn cover. "It's losing money through holes." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Martha opened the long wooden box. Inside were tools. Not sewing tools meant for embroidery. Not tools for making dresses. Heavy curved needles, awls, waxed thread, canvas shears, leather palms. Tools that looked more suited to a shipyard than a farmhouse. Wendell stared. "What exactly is all that?" Martha lifted one of the large curved needles. "My father was a sailmaker." "A sailmaker." She nodded. "He taught me to repair canvas before I learned to read." The evening wind stirred around them. Martha turned the needle in her fingers. "You asked for someone who could sew." "Yes, I can." She pointed toward the ripped wagon cover. "But I don't think curtains are your biggest problem." Wendell laughed softly. For the first time that day. "You don't believe in curtains. I believe in stopping leaks first." Then she pointed toward the barn. "Every one of those tiers costs money. The grain that gets wet, the equipment that wears out, the supplies that must be replaced. Most people only notice what breaks. Very few notice why it breaks. Wendell found himself staring at her. This was not the woman he expected. This was not the future he imagined. And somehow he couldn't stop listening. Then Martha said something that surprised him even more. "If you want a woman who spends every afternoon making lace curtains, tell me now." The prairie grew quiet. "I'll leave tomorrow." Wendell blinked. "What? If that's the wife you're looking for, I'm the wrong woman." She closed the wooden box. "I'll cook, I'll clean, I'll mend your shirts, but I won't sit by a window while everything outside collapses." For several long seconds, neither spoke. Then Wendell looked at the fading sunlight touching the broken buildings. He looked at the torn wagon cover. Then he looked at Martha, and for the first time in years, something felt different. Not easier, not safer, just different, as though a door had opened somewhere he hadn't noticed before. "Stay," he finally said. Martha nodded once. Then she asked a question that would quietly change both their lives. "Show me the worst problem first." And that night, neither of them realized that the woman who arrived carrying a box of needles was about to sew an entire ranch back together, one stubborn seam at a time. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, if you were Wendell, would you have hired Martha after that first conversation? Or would you have thought she was completely wrong about the ranch? The following morning began before sunrise. Martha was already outside when Wendell stepped onto the porch. The Wyoming air carried a sharp chill. Mist drifted over the grass. And in the barnyard, Martha was kneeling beside the torn wagon cover she had inspected the evening before. Her sleeves were rolled up. The large canvas lay stretched across wooden sawhorses. Beside her sat the sailmaker's box. For several minutes, Wendell simply watched. Her hands moved with quiet certainty. No hesitation, no wasted motion. Every stitch looked deliberate, as if she were speaking a language nobody else understood. Otis emerged from the bunkhouse carrying a coffee tin. The older ranch hand stopped when he saw Martha working. "Well," he muttered, "that's a first." "What is?" "Never seen a ranch wife crawl around a barn floor before breakfast." Briggs laughed. "Maybe she's building those curtains you wanted." Wendell tried not to smile, but even he wasn't entirely sure what Martha was doing. By noon, she had the entire wagon cover spread open. She marked weak sections with chalk, removed rotten fabric, cut replacement patches. Then she began rebuilding the damaged sections one piece at a time. Briggs watched from a distance. Eventually, curiosity pulled him closer. Why not just buy a new one? Martha never looked up. "How much does a new cover cost?" $8 or $9. "How much grain will this one protect if it lasts another year?" Briggs opened his mouth, then closed it. He had never thought about it that way. Most people didn't. That was Martha's strange gift. She saw connections other people missed. A ripped canvas wasn't just canvas. It was spoiled grain, lost money, harder winters, longer debt. By evening, she finished the first repair. The wagon cover looked nearly new. Not pretty, not fancy, strong. The next day, spring rain rolled across the valley. Heavy rain. The kind that found every weakness. The kind ranchers secretly feared. Wendell walked outside after breakfast, expecting disappointment. For years, every major rainstorm had ruined something. Grain, equipment, supplies, always something. He climbed onto the wagon and pulled back the repaired cover. The oats underneath were completely dry. Every sack, every handful, dry. He stood there staring. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he climbed down and walked back toward the house. Martha was kneading bread dough. "You checked the wagon." It wasn't a question. Wendell nodded. Dry. A small smile appeared. "Good." That was all she said. No celebration. No boasting. Just good. For some reason, that impressed him even more. Have you ever known someone who didn't need recognition to know they had done something valuable? Over the next several weeks, Martha attacked the ranch the way a skilled doctor attacks an illness. One problem at a time. One solution at a time. No panic. No drama. Just steady improvement. The leaking tents came next. Then grain sacks. Then horse gear. Then harnesses. Then saddle straps. Everywhere she looked, she found hidden losses. And everywhere she found losses, she found ways to stop them. The ranch slowly began changing. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But enough to notice. Enough to feel. Enough to make people talk. The first visitor arrived during the second week. A widow named Ada Foss. She brought eggs, questions, and 3 torn grain sacks. "I heard you're the woman fixing canvas." Martha smiled. "Depends who told you." A man who looked confused. "That narrows it down to half the valley." Ada barked out a laugh. The two women became friends almost immediately. Within days, Ada returned with more sacks. Then her neighbor arrived. Then another rancher. Then another. Small jobs. Tiny repairs. Nothing important. At least that's what everyone thought. But Martha saw something different. Every repair represented money somebody didn't have to spend. Every repair represented value. Every repair represented trust. And trust, once earned, had a way of multiplying. One evening, she opened a small ledger book. Wendell noticed her writing at the kitchen table. "What are you doing?" "Keeping records." "Records of what?" Martha turned the book toward him. On one side, she listed replacement costs. On the other side, she listed repair costs. New grain sack, repair grain sack, new wagon cover, repair wagon cover, new harness, repair harness. Wendell studied the numbers, then studied them again. The difference was staggering. The ranch wasn't just saving money. It was keeping money, money that normally disappeared every season, money that usually leaked away unnoticed, the same way rain leaked through torn canvas. That night, Wendell couldn't sleep. For years, he had worked harder every season, yet somehow ended every year struggling. Now he finally understood something. Hard work alone wasn't enough. You also had to stop losing what you already earned, and Martha seemed to understand that better than anyone he had ever met. The real turning point came with Otis. The stubborn ranch hand had spent weeks quietly doubting her. Not openly, not cruelly, just stubbornly, the way older men often doubted new ideas. Then, one evening, he carried something from the bunkhouse, a folded piece of canvas, old, weathered, nearly destroyed. He placed it carefully on the kitchen table. "My wife's tarp." The room fell silent. Wendell looked up. He had never heard Otis talk about his wife. Not once. "She died before I came west." Otis cleared his throat. "Been carrying this around ever since." Martha unfolded the tarp. Most of it was ruined. Years of weather had destroyed the edges, but the center remained intact. She examined every inch, then looked up. "I can't save all of it." Otis nodded. "I figured, but I can save the part that matters." The old ranch hand said nothing. Neither did Martha. She simply went to work. For 2 days, she carefully cut away damaged sections, reinforced the surviving canvas, bound new edges, strengthened weak areas. When she finished, the tarp was smaller, but strong, useful, whole again. Otis stood staring at it. His eyes remained fixed on the repaired canvas. Then something changed in his expression. Not because the tarp was valuable, because the memory attached to it was. Sometimes people aren't trying to save an object. Sometimes they're trying to save a piece of their life. Martha understood that, perhaps better than anyone. "You kept the important part," Otis finally whispered. The important part was worth keeping. After that day, he never questioned her again. Neither did anyone else. Word spread through Sweetwater Valley. The woman who repaired canvas, the woman who saved ranch equipment, the woman whose repairs lasted longer than new supplies. More customers arrived. More work followed, and slowly, without anyone noticing at first, something remarkable began happening. The ranch that had once been falling apart was becoming one of the best-run properties in the valley. Not because Wendell bought more land, not because cattle prices improved, not because luck changed, because one woman kept refusing to ignore the small things, and before long, those small things would attract the attention of someone far more dangerous than torn canvas or broken fences. A man whose entire fortune depended on people buying replacements instead of repairs. And when he finally noticed Martha Bell, he would decide she needed to be stopped. Before we continue, tell us honestly, which matters more in life? Earning more money, or stopping the money you're already earning from slipping away? I'd love to hear your thoughts below. By midsummer, people no longer referred to Martha as Wendell Carver's mail-order bride. She had become something else entirely, the woman who could save almost anything. Wagon covers, harnesses, grain sacks, tents, even memories. The requests arrived so steadily that Martha often worked long after sunset. The kitchen table became a workbench, the barn became a workshop, and Briggs, who once laughed at the idea of sewing, now spent most afternoons learning every technique Martha knew. One evening, he held up a freshly repaired wagon cover and grinned. "Never thought I'd make a living with a needle." Martha smiled. Neither did half the men who sail ships. The young ranch hand laughed, but secretly he was proud, and for good reason. The repairs were becoming known throughout the valley. More importantly, they were working. People trusted results. Results were difficult to argue with. The change became impossible to ignore when the county fair arrived in August. Ranchers gathered, families filled the streets, merchants competed for business, and rumors traveled faster than horses. That was where Martha first heard about the railroad expansion. A new spur line was pushing north through Wyoming. Construction camps would soon arrive. Hundreds of workers, hundreds of wagons, hundreds of tents. Hundreds of pieces of gear destined to wear out under brutal frontier conditions. Most people heard opportunity. Martha heard something else. Demand. Reliable demand. The kind that could transform an entire future. Across the fairgrounds, another person heard the same news. Lyle Dunmore, owner of the largest mercantile in Sweetwater Crossing. For years, Dunmore had profited from one simple reality. When things broke, people bought replacements, and replacements always came from him. New canvas, new harnesses, new grain sacks, new supplies. Every tier in the valley eventually became money in his pocket. Martha's growing reputation threatened that arrangement. Every repaired item meant one less purchase. Every dollar saved by ranchers was a dollar not spent in his store. The railroad workers represented a fortune, and Dunmore intended to collect every cent of it. The trouble began in September. The railroad construction camp arrived exactly as predicted. Rows of tents stretched across the prairie. Supply wagons crowded the roads. Workers filled the valley. Their quartermaster was a practical man named Sturgis. He cared about only two things: keeping costs down, keeping men working. Everything else was secondary. When Sturgis heard repeated stories about a woman who could repair canvas better than most suppliers could manufacture it, he sent a man to investigate. That man arrived at the Carver Ranch 3 days later. By sunset, Martha had secured her first major contract. The railroad camp would hire her to maintain all canvas equipment throughout the construction season. When Sturgis offered the deal, Martha did not celebrate. Instead, she sat down with her ledger, ran numbers, calculated material costs, estimated labor, and only then accepted. That single decision changed everything. Within weeks, more work arrived than Martha and Briggs could handle alone. She hired Ada Foss's granddaughters, then 2 other women from nearby ranches, then another. The barn transformed into a proper repair workshop. Needles clicked. Waxed threads snapped tight. Canvas moved in and out by the wagon load. For the first time in years, real money began flowing into the Carver Ranch. Not cattle money, not seasonal money, steady money, predictable money, the kind banks respected, the kind debt feared. And that was exactly when Dunmore decided Martha had become dangerous. Have you ever noticed that success often attracts enemies faster than failure does? Dunmore started with gossip. It cost nothing, required little effort, and sometimes worked surprisingly well. He questioned whether a married woman should handle business contracts. He hinted that Martha spent too much time around railroad workers. He suggested her repairs looked strong but would eventually fail. He implied that Wendell had lost control of his household. The rumors spread, not everywhere, not with everyone, but enough to create doubt, enough to create hesitation, enough for Dunmore to believe he was winning. Then nature intervened. Early October brought one of the worst storms the valley had seen in years. Cold rain, freezing wind, driving sleet, the kind of weather that exposed every weakness. The railroad camp hunkered down, canvas strained, tent ropes groaned. Workers prayed their shelters would hold. Most did. One did not. A large mess tent collapsed during the night. Flour was ruined. Bedrolls soaked. Several men narrowly escaped injury. By morning, blame was spreading through camp, and naturally some fingers pointed toward Martha. After all, wasn't she responsible for the tents? Sturgis rode out looking for answers. What he found surprised him. Martha was already there. She had arrived before sunrise, before anyone summoned her, before anyone accused her. The collapsed tent lay open in the mud. Martha knelt beside the failed seam, studying it, examining it, reading it like a book. When Sturgis approached, she didn't defend herself. She simply pointed. "Look." He crouched beside her. "This seam isn't mine." "What do you mean?" Martha traced the stitching. Single-stitched. No wax, no reinforcement, no weather protection. Then she pointed toward another tent still standing. "That one is mine." The difference became obvious immediately. One seam had failed. The other remained strong despite identical conditions. Sturgis inspected both, compared both, studied both, and slowly realized something important. Someone had sold the railroad a poor-quality tent, and someone had been trying very hard to shift blame. By noon, he knew exactly who: Lyle Dunmore, the man who sold the failed tent, the same man spreading rumors, the same man attacking Martha's reputation. That afternoon, Sturgis doubled her contract. Doubled it. Not only did he keep her services, he expanded them. Every piece of railroad canvas would now pass through Martha's workshop. The railroad trusted her completely. Dunmore's plan had backfired, or so everyone thought. The real attack had not begun yet. A week later, Dunmore arrived at the Carver Ranch personally. He rode a fine horse, wore an expensive coat, and carried a leather folder beneath one arm. Wendell sensed trouble immediately. Men like Dunmore rarely traveled 11 miles to deliver good news. The merchant dismounted slowly, smiling, a smile that never reached his eyes. Then he handed over the folder. "I'm here regarding an outstanding debt." Wendell frowned. "What debt?" "The debt attached to this property." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt wrong, heavy, dangerous. Then Wendell opened the folder and felt the blood drain from his face. Years earlier, before he purchased the ranch, the previous owner had borrowed money against the land. The debt remained buried in old paperwork. Recently, Dunmore had quietly purchased the note. Now he demanded payment. $312, 30 days, or he would take the ranch. The number hit Wendell like a rifle shot. $312. It might as well have been $3,000. No rancher could produce that kind of money in a month. Not honestly, not legally, not during autumn. That night, Wendell barely touched his supper. The note sat on the table. The lamp burned low, and every dream he had built seemed ready to collapse. Finally, he looked up. "I've lost it." Martha remained calm. "No, I have not yet. There isn't enough money." Martha was silent for a long moment. Then she opened her ledger, the same ledger that had quietly recorded every repair, every saving, every opportunity. "You're looking at this like a rancher. What other way is there?" Martha's eyes settled on the columns of numbers, the way a sailmaker looks at torn canvas. Wendell frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means we stop staring at the hole." She turned the ledger toward him and start looking at what still holds. Slowly, she explained her plan. The railroad needed more, far more workers, more repairs, more equipment maintenance, more services. The demand already existed. All they had to do was meet it. For the first time that evening, hope returned to Wendell's face. Not certainty, hope. And sometimes hope is enough to keep a person moving. The next morning, Martha rode directly to the railroad camp. Before the month ended, she intended to accomplish something nobody in Sweetwater Valley believed possible. She intended to earn every dollar and force Lyle Dunmore to watch her do it. Before we finish this story, tell me in the comments, if you were facing a debt that seemed impossible to repay, would you fight harder or would you start over somewhere else? The next 4 weeks became the busiest season the Carver Ranch had ever known. Not because of cattle, not because of better weather, because Martha Bell refused to believe that a problem was impossible, simply because everyone else said it was. The railroad contract expanded almost immediately. Sturgis introduced her to supervisors from neighboring work camps. Word traveled along the line. A camp with strong canvas stayed dry. Dry workers stayed healthy. Healthy workers stayed productive. And productive workers made railroad companies very happy. Within days, new repair orders began arriving faster than the workshop could complete them. Canvas wagon covers, tent roofs, harness gear, supply tarps, grain sacks. Everything seemed to need attention. Everything seemed to arrive at once. The old barn that had once leaned toward collapse became the busiest building in the valley. Long work tables filled the center aisle. Lanterns burned late into the evening. The steady sound of needles pulling through canvas echoed from sunrise until dark. Women arrived from neighboring ranches looking for work. Some were widows. Some were wives trying to help support struggling families. Some had spent years sewing clothing and blankets, without ever imagining those skills could earn an income. Martha hired them all, patiently teaching each one, showing them how to identify weak seams, how to reinforce stress points, how to repair damage before it became failure. Soon, 6 women worked regularly in the barn, then 7, then 8. The workshop became something none of them had expected, a business, a real one. Ada Foss visited often and proudly declared that the valley had spent years overlooking talents, sitting right in front of them. For once, nobody argued with her. The money accumulated steadily, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. And every evening, Martha recorded every dollar in her ledger, every payment, every expense, every profit, every opportunity. While Wendell worried about the deadline, Martha focused on the numbers, one day at a time, one repair at a time, one contract at a time, the way she always had. Because panic rarely solves problems, work often does. As the final week approached, rumors spread through Sweetwater Crossing. Most people knew about the debt by then. Small towns always know. Many assumed the Carvers would lose everything. Others quietly hoped they would succeed. Even those who had doubted Martha in the beginning found themselves rooting for her. The valley had watched her save equipment, save businesses, save livelihoods. Now everyone wondered whether she could save her own ranch. Dunmore certainly didn't believe she could. He continued walking through town with the confidence of a man who already considered the property his. He spoke openly about future plans, about improvements, about expansion, about what he would do with the land once the Carvers were forced out. But confidence and certainty are not always the same thing, because deep down, even Dunmore had begun to notice something troubling. Every time he expected Martha Bell to fail, she didn't. The final payment from the railroad arrived 3 days before the deadline. Martha sat at the kitchen table late that evening. The ledger open, coins stacked, banknotes arranged in neat piles. She counted once, then twice, then a third time. Finally, she closed the book, looked across the table at Wendell, and smiled. "We have it." For a moment, Wendell simply stared, not trusting himself to speak, not trusting himself to believe. Then he looked down at the money. $312, every cent, earned. Not borrowed, not gifted, earned. The weight that lifted from his shoulders in that moment felt almost physical. Have you ever carried a burden for so long that you forgot what it felt like to stand without it? The morning Dunmore arrived was bright and cold. The first real hint of winter touched the valley. Frost sparkled across the grass, smoke curled from chimneys, and a surprising number of people happened to be nearby. Some because they had business, others because they were curious, a few because they wanted to witness history. Dunmore rode into the yard exactly on schedule, confident, certain, prepared to claim the ranch. Then he saw the wagons, the workers, the repaired canvas stacked neatly beside the barn, the activity, the prosperity, the life. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face, only briefly, but it was there. He dismounted, straightened his coat, and approached the porch. "I've come for payment." Martha stepped forward, carrying a heavy cloth sack. "We know." She placed the sack on the porch railing, opened it, and began counting. One note, then another, then another. Coins followed. The growing stack became impossible to ignore. The yard grew silent. Every person watching understood exactly what was happening. Dunmore understood too. His expression changed with every dollar, because every dollar represented a failure of his plan. When Martha finished counting, the total exceeded the debt by $3. $3. Not much, but enough. Enough to make a point. $315, Martha said calmly. "The debt is $312. The extra $3 is for your inconvenience." A few people nearby struggled to hide their smiles. Dunmore did not. He simply stared. For perhaps the first time in his life, he had no clever response, no advantage, no leverage, no control, only defeat. Wendell accepted the note, carefully read it, then handed it to Sturgis, who had ridden out specifically to witness the payment. The railroad manager verified everything. The debt was legitimate. The payment was complete. The ranch was free. Only then did Wendell tear the note in half. Then again and again. The pieces drifted onto the porch floor. Nobody spoke. The moment required no explanation. The land belonged to the Carvers. Completely. Finally. Forever. Dunmore wrote the receipt, his hand noticeably less steady than usual. Then he mounted his horse and rode away. No speech, no argument, no dramatic confrontation. Just a man leaving with less than he arrived carrying. Because sometimes the most satisfying victory is not revenge. It's simply surviving long enough to prove someone wrong. The months that followed transformed the valley. The workshop continued growing. Additional railroad contracts arrived. More ranchers became customers. Women throughout Sweetwater earned income from skills once considered ordinary household work. Briggs eventually supervised much of the daily operation. Ada Foss proudly claimed credit for half the success despite having little evidence. Nobody bothered correcting her. And the Carver Ranch prospered. Not quickly, not magically, steadily, the same way Martha repaired everything else. One careful stitch at a time. One evening, near the start of winter, Wendell stood beside the cabin window watching the workshop lamps glow in the distance. The sound of work drifted softly through the cold air. Behind him, Martha sat reading. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Wendell looked toward the blue gingham curtains hanging neatly over the window, the very thing he had wanted when he first wrote to the marriage agency. The thing he once believed he needed most. "I finally got my curtains." Martha glanced up. A small smile touched her lips. "Are they everything you hoped for?" Wendell looked back toward the workshop, toward the women working, toward the ranch saved from ruin, toward the future neither of them had expected. Then he smiled. "No." Martha raised an eyebrow. "No, they're nowhere near enough." For the first time in years, the loneliness that had followed him across the frontier was gone. Not because someone had decorated his home, not because someone had cooked his meals, not because someone had mended his shirts, because someone had chosen to build a future beside him. And sometimes that's the greatest repair of all. Thank you for spending time with us today on USOS Stories. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. What was the real thing Martha repaired the ranch, the debt, or Wendell himself? And if you enjoy stories of resilience, frontier love, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Don't forget to subscribe to USOS Stories. We would be honored to have you join us for the next journey across the American frontier.